All right, so a few more ownership regulations, then we'll finish this off. And then, like I said, if you have any questions about the study guide that you came across over the weekend, then I'll be happy to take your questions. And again, the study guide is up on course materials. So cross ownership. This is when one owner or one organization can purchase multiple companies in different media industries. So as you can see, these regulations used to be a lot more strict. It used to be prohibited for one company to own both a local TV station and the local newspaper. Now, not so much. And you might think, well, newspaper, television, I mean, who watches both? Well, still a fairly decent segment of the population. They might be a little bit older. Families or folks who enjoyed getting the newspaper delivered to their front door or their mailbox in the 80s and 90s, they may still have a subscription to the local paper. If there is a local paper, that's another issue. If there is a local paper still, then families who have just always gotten the local paper delivered probably still do. It's the younger folks who were kids in the 80s and 90s when their parents were getting the local newspaper that probably, now that they're adults, have moved away from that, who don't get the subscriptions. So sure, it's probably an older audience that gets newspaper, but this older audience that gets the newspaper delivered to them in the morning is probably also the same audience that's watching their local nightly news at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. So if that organization is owned by the same group, again, are we looking at a variety of messages? Probably not. Same stories are covered, same perspectives are shared. And then duopolies. This is two similar types of media in the same market, such as if Sinclair owned two local TV stations in the same town. That seems like you would get even less diversity of voices. And it would be more advantageous for Sinclair, obviously. If you are, for some reason, a diehard fan of a particular news anchor, and trying to remember if we cover this term in 345. I know I talk about it in COM 350, and a lot of you have taken COM 350 with me. But there's this concept called parasocial relationships, where we, the television viewing audience, feel a connection to someone that we see on TV. Sometimes it's a character from a show, and we feel a strong connection toward them, and we get upset when bad things happen to them, if they get their hearts broken, or if they are killed off a particular TV show, then we feel awful, we feel terrible. But sometimes these parasocial relationships can exist with real people, like local TV personalities. And if you've lived in the same town for 30 years and you've been watching the same news anchor at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock every night for 30 years, you're going to feel like you know him or her. You're going to feel some sort of connection. So it's kind of like brand loyalty. You feel loyal to this particular anchor. So, you know, a news organization, ownership organization like Sinclair is counting on that kind of brand loyalty. But if you're new to a town and you don't have a lot of brand loyalty and you're switching through local channels to figure out which news best suits you, well, that would please Sinclair as well, especially if they own two of those networks that you're switching through. Now, obviously, this is maybe a total benefit for the company, because not only are your choices limited as an audience member, but they get to save on costs, cut down on costs. They might, instead of having, separate sales forces at each of the stations, they might just have one salesperson, one sales staff, so they can cut down on the number of people they hire. And then finally, We've been talking a lot about cable companies. We've been talking an awful lot about how cable companies are near monopolies and how the cable, the 10 or so popular cable companies in this country have become masters at horizontal integration. So remember, that's horizontal integration, geez. Or when a small number of companies control an entire industry. So certainly that would be the same with cable. But cable could argue, and has argued, and most definitely argued 30 years ago when cable was starting to become a force and starting to compete with broadcast television. Cable argued that it would be inefficient to have another cable company in this town compete with us. Because how does cable work? Well, we got to dig up a bunch of land and property and bury the cable lines deep down in the ground and upset people's property. Can you imagine if we had 3 or 4 different cable companies trying to compete and laying cable everywhere? Same thing well over 100 years ago with the telegraph. So anything that involves something like laying cable or wires with the telegraph across the oceans, where it just doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of companies to try to install that same type of technology because it would just create havoc. It would upset people's lives. There wouldn't be enough physical room. Cable companies would argue, hey, we're a natural monopoly. We're a natural monopoly, but we'll enter into agreements with the cities and states to provide certain content. Most cable companies have to provide your basic local networks and public access stations. So they go into agreements with the geographic regions that they cover. And for the most part, although in the 80s when cable was really taking off, for the most part, the cable companies try their best, or the government tries its best to make sure that the cable companies keep their rates competitive. And they don't try to price gouge people. And even, more recent with Microsoft and Bill Gates, with Windows, he argued that he should be a natural monopoly. So, that is it for Chapter 4. Are there any questions? And what I can do, if you all want to, I can stop sharing this. And I can start sharing this. And I don't know, however you all want to proceed is fine with me. As I said, you should have access to all of the lectures that I've done today, I've done one. All the lectures that I've done over the past 5 or 6 weeks or so. So those are all under the course materials page in the folder that says class lectures. And I just updated the one from last Friday about an hour ago in my office. So that's ready to go. So you can obviously take this study guide and go back through the PowerPoints, through the lectures, through the book chapters. But if you have any particular questions, from any of the chapters on the study guide, then you can certainly ask me about it. You can type a question in the chat. You can ask it out loud because I think my speakers are working. I hope my speakers are working.
What was the Creative Commons movement?
Creative Commons is when artists give up a little bit of their copyrights so that in the future, if a new artist wants to sample any part of their music, then they can do so without many restrictions. And the reason that some artists give up their copyrights, some of their copyright protections now, is because they're smart business people, and they realize that in 10 years, if a new musician or a new band wants to cover their previous work, then that could expose an older artist or an older band to a brand new audience, a younger audience, and that could increase their sales.
Gotcha.
Good. You asked me a question I knew the answer to. That's always my fear when I do these big reviews. It's like, have I forgotten something?
I had a bit of a hard time understanding why radio was eventually granted a commercial mandate as opposed to a public one.
Too much competition, and like often because the military wanted their chunk of the magnetic spectrum. Broadcasting companies did, and really it's kind of simple. Just with any kind of any kind of business decision, it all came down to how can we make money off this, and that became the primary goal. They decided, you know what, we can serve the public interest and make money at the same time. So that would be a lot better, advertising money, obviously. So they decided that would be better than just serving the public interest and perhaps not cashing in on the big advertising bucks that would be available to them. So really it all came down to money and business and advertising dollars.
Thank you.
Sure. Unilateral is when one country imposes standards. Multilateral is when a number of countries pose regulations on media. Antitrust is when one or a small number of companies are thought to have too much control, like going back to the Paramount decree that I talked about last week, where Paramount had directors, actors, actresses, producers, editors, all under contract, and you couldn't go work on any other movie unless if you were under contract with Paramount, you couldn't work on any other movie. Or any other movie that was being produced by another studio. So, and that went all the way down to Paramount owned a lot of movie houses, cinemas too, and kind of had some unfair business practices. So it's the idea of unfair business practices based around a company that has way too much power. And antitrust lawsuits are a way to get that company, hopefully, if a court agrees with you, to get them to divest some of their organization and maybe make it easier to do business with them, because Paramount was doing a lot of block booking where they would give small independent theaters the chance to show their movies, but they would also give them 3 or 4 terrible movies at the same time and say, here, show these too, knowing that they probably weren't going to do very big business. Anything else?
Back to unilateral and multilateral, like when it is the multiple countries posting their standards, are they all the same standards? Is that why it's the
It's a number of countries that agree on a similar set of standards, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay.
And you can think of a number of countries that are close together in geography, like European countries. Anything else?
With sunk costs, I have the idea of what it is, but I'm having trouble defining it. How would you do that?
Money that you will never, ever, ever see again because you invest it before the product is made. And so, these are when movie studios pay big bucks for an A-list actor or actress. So they, agree to a however much top movie stars make now. They agree to a $50 million contract with that actor or actress up front, and that money is gone. Even if the movie does terrible business, they're not getting that money back. So it's all sunk costs are everything that a studio or a film studio, TV studio, record label, that's the money that they put up front to get the best actors they can get, the best, if it's the record business, the best producer or engineer they can get, the money they're going to give a band up front so they can go out and buy the best instruments. So it's all the money that they put up front, that the big organizations put up front, that they will never get back, even if the product they're making doesn't sell.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure. Anything else? Something in chat here. Sure. Vertical integration is when vertical integration is just kind of what I was talking about with Paramount back in the early days, early 20th century, where they controlled every aspect of how a product is made. And that means that they controlled if you're making a movie, they controlled the production of it, so the actors, the directors, they controlled the distribution, they controlled the aggregation. Vertical integration is, let's say Disney makes a movie, they hire all the actors, they hire the directors, they distribute it through their own distribution channels, they aggregate it or advertise it on the Disney Channel or Disney Plus. So every aspect of that film or television show's production and release is controlled by Disney. If you're not a huge corporation, you probably only control a little bit of that. So if you're a smaller TV studio, you can probably have enough to pay the actors and maybe the directors, but once the TV show pilot is made, you have to do business, go into negotiations or have a contract with maybe a distribution company whose job it is to shop your TV pilot around to different networks or different cable channels. They don't work for they aren't part of your company, but your company hires them to do the job of distribution. And then horizontal is like the cable companies or the record industry for the longest time was a really good example of horizontal integration, where one particular media industry is dominated by maybe 3 or 4 companies. Very close to being monopolistic. Very little room for competition. Anything else? How would domestic versus global differentiate between 19 and 20 media technology? Simply, certainly American companies, American TV and movie production companies were, up until probably the 80s or so, interested mostly on box office numbers and how well a product would sell in the US. And then as DVDs became more popular, and then as other countries started developing their own kind of movie studios and movie industries, the idea of globalization, especially with digital, became much easier to share digital movies across continents than it was physical copies like VHS tapes or DVDs or things like that. So it just became easier to share movies with different studios across the country, different cinemas across the country, and across other countries as well, across continents. And what that did was around 2000 or so, the movie studios here, they still like their movies to have a nice opening weekend box office in the US, but it's not the end of the world if they don't. And if a movie, quote unquote, bombs, then again, it's still not the end of the world. They can perhaps make their money back by shipping it to overseas markets. So anymore, movie studios are as interested in overseas markets and how a movie might play overseas than they are in US box offices. And now they're also interested in Netflix and Hulu and streaming services as well, because that's certainly a more lucrative way to make money than the VHS and the Blockbusters and the DVDs back in the day. Sure. Anything else? All right, then let me just say again, make sure that you don't come to class Wednesday. And actually, let's not come to class Friday either. That sounds like a plan. But be in front of your whatever device is your favorite, your laptop or your desktop, or I guess your phone. I've had students tell me that they take tests on phones. I don't know. If you do, good luck. But if that's your only option, then that's your only option. I have an iPhone 7. I would never take a test on it. I don't even like ordering HEB curbside on it because I'm afraid it's going to screw up my order. But if you got a good phone and you can take a test on it, that's fine. But I still think a laptop or desktop is the better way to go. So be in front of that at 9:20 on Wednesday, or a little bit earlier, just so you can start right at 9:20. And you will see the exam at the bottom of the course materials page. It will pop up magically at 9:20, and then you'll have until 10:20 to finish it. And again, you can go back and look through course materials and check out the lectures or the chapters that I've posted to help you answer some of the questions. So it is technically kind of an open book or open note test. But again, please don't share questions or answers or take pictures of the test or, put the GroupMe down during the test. Feel free to study using GroupMe, but no GroupMe during the test. Just take it by yourself. So, any questions?
There was one more in the chat.
Oh. I would. I don't know. Maybe not reread. Maybe reskim. Is that a term? Reskim. Reskim the chapters, because you know, certainly that you can find more detail about a term in the chapter and probably an example or two in the chapter than you would on my PowerPoint, even though I try my best to give some real life examples of these terms. But yeah, you know, I would always recommend going back through the text chapters, but I don't know that you need to actually reread every word of them. Maybe just look at the PowerPoints and find the key terms and concepts, and then go back through the chapters and find where those concepts are listed, and check out the explanations and the examples they give in the book. Anything else?